Hello, I'm Ben Graham, and this is Data Management 3, which is Data Management for Visualization. And so the focus here is actually on summarizing data, right? So when we're visualizing data descriptively, we have thousands or sometimes millions of data points, and we need to summarize the information for an audience. And so a lot of what we're doing before we can make a picture, we can make a picture of every single point of data, these big clouds. But these are really hard to understand sometimes. So sometimes we need to collapse that information down. And then we can make a nice little plot of how this variable changes over time around the world or something like this, right? But that often means condensing down to annual averages or region year averages, things like that before we can make the pictures that we might want to look at. So this is really a training about collapsing data down, which we'll mostly do with two functions: group by, which tells us what groups we want to collapse down to, and then summarize at, which tells us which variables we want to summarize and how we want to do that, whether we want to take the sum of those variables across whatever units we're grouping by, whether we want to take the average or the maximum value or the minimum value, right? We've got some different options of how we summarize these things. All right, so we'll head into this R script that I'm sharing with you. So we've got standard header, removing the junk in the environment before we get going, setting our working directory to the training data subfolder, installing the packages that we're going to use today. And we won't use the country code package in this first video, but we're going to use it in the second or third video as we go through this. Okay, so we're working with our power sharing data again today. We like to use the data we create in the lab in our own trainings and get you all familiar with it. And the first thing I'm going to do is sort of say, look, before you go to visualize and describe something, like, do a little due diligence, take a look at these variables, take a look at what you're summarizing. So we're going to work with just 3 variables today in this video: subnational control of education policy, subnational control of police forces, and the right of subnational governments to levy their own taxes. So this is sort of measures of subnational policy authority. We'll keep our key unit identifier variables here: Greenwich ward number and year, and we'll keep the country name because that's a nice one to actually be able to kind of see what's going on in our data. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to create little tables of the values in these measures of subnational policy authority. They should all be dummy variables. We should just see zeros and ones, but oops, we see that each of these variables has one observation that takes a value of 2. So that's a little problematic. So before we go ahead and visualize this stuff, I'm going to run a pretty simple filter command to just filter out that problem observation. I'm going to say, look, only keep the observations for which either subed is not equal to 2, so it could be 0 or 1, but it's not equal to 2, or if is.na is true. So keep it if it's 0 or 1, and keep it if it's na. You might think, hey, you said keep it if it's not equal to 2. Na is not equal to 2. Shouldn't you keep that? But for whatever reason, the default setting in R is to kick out the NAs when you filter like this. So if you want to keep the NAs, you've got to write in this OR statement to make sure that they're retained in the data. So if I run this command, we're going to see that I drop from 1,749 observations down to 1,748. So I've just gotten rid of one observation. If we take a quick look, yep, looks like it took care of the sub-police issue and the sub-tax issue kind of at the same time here. We're just down to zeros and ones. So we're ready to collapse our data and make some pictures. So this first collapse we're going to do is, what if we wanted to talk about the prevalence of these institutions over time, right? How common is it to decentralize authority, and how's that been changing over time in the world, right? That's a pretty good question to ask. And that means we want to take all this country year data and turn it into just yearly averages or yearly sums. So we're going to start with yearly sums. How many countries in the world have subnational control of education policy in each year? How many countries in the world have subnational control of police or paramilitary forces in each year, right? So we're going to collapse this down. So we're still working in the tidyverse here. So we're going to pipe stuff together. We're going to start with this IDC data. We're going to group it by year. So we're going to collapse it down by year. That's our grouping variable. And the variables that we're going to summarize are education policy, sub-police, and sub-tax, right? So we're going to use this summarize at function, and we're going to tell it the variables to work with, and we're going to tell it that we want the sum here. And the last thing we're going to tell it is na.rm equals true, which is when we're adding these up, R doesn't know how to add an NA, right? So we have to tell it. And we tell it just get rid of that NA and just add up the zeros and ones that are there. So this is, you can think about it when we're taking the sum, that's the equivalent of treating those NAs as if they're zeros, right? Because they're not going to end up in that sum. So that, just want to be aware of that's what's happening with the NA information. So let's run this and let's see then what the resulting object is. So I'm going to create this yearly count one, this new object. And let's take a look at it. Let's take a look at that object. Okay. So we see that now we don't have country or date anymore. We just have year, and we've got these totals for each of our three variables. And we see that it looks like sub-tax is increasing in frequency over time, more or less, that we get a retrenchment here in the last year. Sub-police, relatively stable over time. Sub-ed, relatively stable over time in terms of the number of countries out there that have this type of subnational policy authority. Okay, great. But if we think about the changing prevalence of these institutions over time, is sum really the way to do it? Maybe not, right? Because as I mentioned, if let's say over time, and particularly right here, we're just working with this 2010 to 2019 window, we have this power sharing data all the way back to 1975, right? And from 1975 to the present, we've actually had a lot of new countries come into the system. If some of those new countries have these institutions, the frequency of these institutions are going to go up, even if the proportion of the world in which this is occurring, even if these institutions aren't becoming more frequent, right? It's also the case, if we had a bunch of missing data back in the 70s and 80s, these sums are going to be pretty low. And just as we fill in the blanks, as we get better information going forward, as these encyclopedias and things that we draw on become more available, as constitutions become more available, that we may have better data coverage in the future, and that might make these institutions look more prevalent. So maybe sum isn't the way we want to do this, right? That maybe we actually want to think about the mean, right? Of all, we want to scale that sum by the total number of countries in the world, right? So if you take the mean of a dummy variable, you're going to get the proportion of the countries in the world that have this institution instead of just the number. Maybe that's a better way to do it. So we'll create this new object, yearly proportion one. We'll run exactly the same code, but we'll just switch this mean. So you really want to think substantively when you have, there's always this question of like, okay, what's the idea I want to communicate to my audience with this figure? And then what is the best statistic with which to do it? And that's not always obvious. And so here you'll see that while, we still see a slight increase in the prevalence of sub-tax, much as we did, and stability in sub-police and stability in sub-ed. So, we haven't changed the picture substantively much with this difference, but I do think this is probably a more precise way to look at this. So that's sort of the group by and the summarize at, and we will move on to some other types of data manipulation in the second video here.